All right, everybody, welcome to Classical Mythology. I'm going to start us off with just a brief presentation, just to kind of set the stage for a number of things, and just give us a sense of kind of where we're going, clarify some terminology before we get into the kind of the heart of some particular topics very, very soon. So one of the things that I really like about a mythology class is that, in many ways, as a humanities class, it's a bunch of classes rolled into one, um, and so it allows us to kind of look at this topic from a number of different angles and each one it gives a new set of information, a new lens on a particular story or set of stories or characters that just makes it such a rich a field of study. So on this first slide here, I just have a number of topics that we'll touch upon in smaller and bigger ways throughout our time together. So, of course, obviously, mythology, you might kind of assume that it would most predominantly function as a kind of a literature course, and that's definitely going to be a big part of what we're doing here. Reading stories, analyzing them, talking about them, and see how they fit into an ancient context, see how they've been retold and repackaged throughout the years. So that's definitely, certainly, probably the most prominent way we're going to be approaching mythology in this course. Religion. One of the things that I'm personally am particularly interested in is to kind of explore how these stories, how these gods and goddesses functioned as objects of worship for the ancient Greeks. And so it's a great way to kind of put us back in this ancient context and to really think about, what did it mean for these ancient Greeks to believe in these gods and to worship these gods, and not so much just remove ourselves from that context by treating these things as stories on a page. Art, architecture, and archaeology. Ideally, this class would be taught in Greece, and we would talk about Athena, in front of the Parthenon on the Acropolis. We would talk about Zeus at ancient Olympia, but of course, we can't do that in a class like this. But I'm a very firm believer in kind of the tangibility of learning. So we're going to be looking at lots of artistic depictions of gods and goddesses. We're going to look at lots of temple architecture. We're going to be looking at lots of kind of ancient archaeological remains as a tangible way of understanding who the ancient Greeks were and how they worshipped these deities. Ancient history. This is technically not a history class, but it's always good to have, I think, a chronological framework of kind of the when of what we're dealing with, along with kind of the what and the who. And so, while it's not going to be a huge component of this course, I think it's any good mythology course will traffic in the ancient chronologies. Psychology, psychoanalytics. This won't be a huge part of our class, but this one of the topics we'll be talking about or speculating about is where do myths come from? In fact, in your very first readings for this class, Mr. Powell in our text will approach that topic, and where do these myths come from? Who started these stories? How did they develop? And one of the more modern theories is that not all myths, but some myths give us a window into kind of the subconscious tickings of humanity. Maybe some of you have heard of Sigmund Freud's theory about the Oedipus Complex, and how about the story of Oedipus, which we'll be reading, is his explanation. That story comes out of kind of human psychological and sexual development. And so these stories are ways of kind of uncovering the hidden subconscious parts of us. It's a very interesting idea. Pedagogy. We'll talk about not only kind of where did these myths come from, but why did the Greeks tell these stories? And there are as many different answers to that question as there are myths. But one of the things that does come up again and again, pedagogy, meaning to teach. These stories had morals. These stories had kind of a point of view that was meant to instruct. Even if it's a cautionary tale, to kind of to tell you how not to behave. It's a big part of lots of the myths that we read. And of course, entertainment. It's important to recognize the importance of this. If these stories were not entertaining, one, we would not bother reading them today, and we wouldn't bother going back to them to tell and retell them time and time again. We'll be talking about how in the modern era, not even the modern era, ever since these stories first started to circulate, they've been told and retold and repackaged and painted and sculpted and filmed. It's a well that we as storytellers around the world, particularly in the West, go back to time and time again. And so this is not to I don't want to undervalue the entertainment aspect of this. It's very, very important. And then kind of pre-science. One of the things that we'll see, particularly in these creation stories, which we'll be looking at very soon, is one of the ways that myths functioned was to explain the natural world around us. Where did that mountain come from? Where did this river come from? Why does that landmass, why is it shaped the way it is? Mythology had a way of explaining these things through narrative, through literature, through metaphor. And so in an era that it was before, the Western Enlightenment and the scientific method, mythology often filled that gap of explaining why the world is as it is. Incidentally, the figure on my backslide here. Anybody know who this is? Give up. That's the god Dionysus, who is the god of revel and wine and madness and nature, who we'll be exploring later on in the course. One of my favorites. So unpredictable and wild and savage and alluring, all wrapped up into one. All right. One thing that I always like to address in a kind of a first lecture is the kind of the word myth itself. Just because when we use that word today, we so often use it as a synonym for a lie. We often will use that word in common speech as a dismissive term, like, oh, that's just a myth. And when we use that word that way, it certainly drains myth of any kind of useful meaning. Right? And I think it comes from kind of our post-enlightenment kind of scientific bias way of looking at the world. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But somewhere along the way, kind of the word myth, I think, has been cheapened. And so I want to clear that up. And so, when we use the word myth as to mean a lie, there's kind of the idea behind that is if something didn't literally happen, then it has no value. And I couldn't disagree more with that statement, particularly when it comes to kind of a serious study of mythology. So if we look at the word myth itself comes from a Greek word, mythos, as so many of our words in the English language come from the ancient Greeks and also from the Romans. Mythos is just, it's kind of a spoken word. It's a spoken story. It literally means a word, an utterance, speech, just any kind of sound that comes out of your mouth. To extend that would be a tale told orally from one person to another, one person to a group. That's what mythos, that's what a myth literally means, and it speaks to this oral tradition that myth comes from. One of the things you'll see in the Powell text is that he talks about one of the ways we define a myth, say, as opposed to a legend or a folktale or an epic or such. I mean, all of those can have shades of myth about them. But the idea, one of the important ways to define a myth is that a myth, you can't pinpoint its origin. You can't pinpoint it to an author and say, this person came up with this story, and that was the beginning point. No, what defines a myth often is if you go back through time and you try to pinpoint the origin, you kind of get lost in that fog of prehistory. And the idea is that myth is kind of a body of storytelling that is produced by a culture. And a culture develops it and changes it and tweaks it along the way. Often a myth will have many different versions along the way, and so it's an endlessly changeable, malleable kind of thing that's often at odds with the way we tend to like our stories. At least in the Western world today, we like to what's the official version, what's the canonical version, and so I want to challenge kind of our notions of storytelling and originality and truth and all of that throughout this semester. So to end this short kind of first presentation, I want to share with you this really interesting quote I found regarding you might call two of the great modern myth makers of the last 100 years. J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course is most famous for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis, who is probably most famous for his Chronicles of Narnia. Two monumental multi-volume works of modern mythology that were certainly reliant upon ancient mythologies. If you know anything about these guys, both Tolkien and Lewis were professors, and they're professors of literature. They knew their mythology inside and out, and they built their modern myths on these archetypes and foundations and story patterns of antiquity in building their own myths. Now, you also might know that Tolkien and Lewis were friends. They belonged to different colleges, but universities, but they were colleagues in the broad sense. They belonged to kind of a debating society of people that shared their work together. And you also might know that Tolkien and Lewis were both men of the Christian faith. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and Lewis was a Protestant believer in Christianity. And one of the things they debated about was about myth and how it functioned, and how it kind of it changed their view of the world, that changed their view of their own religion and faith. And so I found this wonderful quote, and I'll just read through it here. Is that it stems from that Lewis and Tolkien were having kind of a disagreement on kind of the usefulness of myth. Tolkien had been a Catholic believer for a long time. Lewis was new to the faith, and so Lewis was, in the scope of this debate here, was kind of more skeptical about the usefulness of myth when it came to what we might call truth. So I pick up the quote here. Myths, Lewis told Tolkien, were lies and therefore worthless, even though lies breathe through silver, was his phrase. So this idea is that, well, at the end of the day, they're just stories. They're not true. Breathe through silver, they're pretty stories. They're very nice stories. But at the end of the day, he kind of, Lewis offered almost kind of that modern use of the word myth. It's an untruth and therefore worthless. But Tolkien disagreed. No, Tolkien replied, they are not lies. Far from being lies, they were the best way, sometimes the only way, of conveying truths that would otherwise remain inexpressible. We have come from God, Tolkien argued, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Myths may be misguided, but they steer however shakily toward the true harbor, whereas materialistic progress leads only to the abyss and the power of evil. So I don't think you need to fully buy into Tolkien or Lewis's Christian faith to appreciate Tolkien's view of myth here. I mean, what he's saying here is that myths have a remarkable way at getting at truths that science and logic and kind of a black and white way of looking at the world simply cannot do. There's something about myth that can kind of point us to a deeper kind of truth, a deeper kind of human truth, in a way that other disciplines simply cannot. And so it's that kind of wonderful, very mysterious, mystical, optimistic way of viewing myth that I want to kind of be our square one in this course. And not to simply treat these as kind of pretty stories, breathe through silver, but as profound stories that tells us something deeply about ourselves and deeply about the human condition. All right? Okay, enough for this short one, and I'll see you in the next one.